welcome to OCU Now, where we discuss the topics OCU students care about. I'm your host, Jamison Keefover. On today's show, we will be talking to political science experts about the recent Women's March. Stay tuned, we have a great show planned for you. Joining us today is political scientist and professor at Oklahoma City University, Kate Huston, and political science department chair and history department chair at Oklahoma City University, Dr. Richard Johnson. Thank you both for being here. So we're going to start discussing the Women's March. First, I would like to know what your initial take was on the march and the protest the day after the inauguration.
I mean, I think the first thought that I came to my mind was that it was much larger than I think I initially thought it was going to be. And the idea that it was really spread across the country and really internationally was a surprise. I didn't expect for it to be to garner that much enthusiasm and that much, have that much of a catalyst effect in terms of policy going forward, in terms of ideas.
I would echo what my colleague has to say, although in a perverse manner, I sort of wondered where these people were, whether they voted or not.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a big question, even Donald Trump himself. So I want to know, what were people protesting? Was it Donald Trump? Because that has been said over and over again that it was the protest of Donald Trump. But several people have came out and said that they were protesting abortion, they were protesting women's health, Planned Parenthood, several different things, as well as LGBTQIA groups coming out. So what was the real purpose of the movement that they created?
I mean, for me, just looking at it through, social media or listening to friends who went out to the protests, I think it was a women's march, but women's issues are not one issue. You're talking about a whole series of issues. Mm-hmm. And so what motivated all of those individual people to come out, I think, were a variety of issues, whether it was, the defunding of Planned Parenthood, which we're now, of course, seeing going forward. Was it this question of, abortion or access to, women's health, is it LGBTQ rights? And so there was a whole variety of issues, I think. And there were people who were across the aisle coming out. There were both Republicans and Democrats, primarily Democrats, and independents. But there were certainly across aisle people who were coming out in support of a number of different issues. Mm-hmm.
I do think that there was a Trump element to this, though, given several of the things that he had said during the campaign. And at least some of the signs, if you're trying to look at the different signs and what have you, were directed at him. But when you have the kind of controversial things that he said about women, that's at least part of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that having not one sole motivation can cause kind of the controversy that has kind of came out of this, or does it kind of cloud the effect that they're wanting to bring?
I mean, I think women's issues in general, you can talk about them as a collective, but you can also break them down to specific issues. I don't think that the variety of issues necessarily clouds the effect, but it certainly gives people something to criticize in terms of if you focus on a specific issue. So talking about women's issues or women's rights writ large is a little bit more difficult to criticize than if you're talking about something, for example, like access to abortion, which is much more controversial. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I mean, I had a friend who asked me the same day, what are they marching for? And I think it was more setting the tone against the tone of the Trump administration and some of the things that have been said.
Okay. As you were saying about, women's rights are very hard to define. We have a video from Tomi Lahren from The Blaze where she talks about her thoughts the day after the march. So we have this clip for you now. Let's take a look.
But it's not just the marchers. It's the feminist movement and really the collective left who preach tolerance and understanding, but only for those people and issues they believe in. Meanwhile, they point fingers at Trump or Trump supporters and label us all bigots with their cardboard signs, their hashtags, and their exclusive moral high ground. We're just not good enough to stand on. Well, bull. If you had a hard time explaining the results of the election to your daughters, that's a parenting problem, not a Trump problem. Geez, I would hope you'd encourage your daughters to have a thick skin, a good grasp on reality, rather than a victimhood mentality and a snowflake exterior. Be a Democrat, that's fine, but don't stand there with your signs and your march and pretend you speak for women because you don't.
Now, Tomi Lahren, she has over 600,000 Twitter followers. She has been an outspoken conservative for the millennial generation, definitely. So what do you think about this? Her comments and kind of being one of the forefront of the conservative millennials that we see.
I think a lot of her points are valid, honestly. I think that the media has not always been fair in terms of its balance. And I understand where some of the frustration comes from. You know, did these people vote? Everybody has the right to free speech. Maybe we don't have the right to free wine.
She makes that comment a lot, calling them snowflakes and kind of building them up. What do you think about this?
I think this question about who speaks for women, I think that many people can speak for women, but I think that we make the mistake of assuming that all women's issues are one-sided. And really the women's movement is, across a number of issues. And there are issues that you can agree on, that both parties can agree on, and there's issues that the parties don't agree on. And you see that within this march, that there is a difference of opinion on a number of issues within the women's movement.
Very true. So she mentions the term feminist, and that term has been thrown around a lot lately. And I've noticed that to different people, it means a different thing. So as a political scientist, how do people within politics view the term feminism now?
Well, the way it ought to be viewed, in my opinion, is this is somebody who is really engaged in wanting to promote equality and women's rights, whether it's comparable worth, whether it's maybe some moral stand of some sort, whether it's women's health. I think you're looking out for these broader issues, and it shouldn't be demonized in the way that other terms have been.
What do you think?
I mean, feminism is a longstanding, philosophical idea. So I think, again, to boil it down to, a tweet or a hashtag about what we think feminism is in the 21st century is a mistake. It's a very deep philosophical, idea. It encompasses many different perspectives, and I think that when you just boil it down to saying that feminism is ideologically left, it is a mistake, and I think it does a disservice to women in general.
Do you think people having different ideas of what it means causes either a negative response by people who see it as a negative term today, or like in the Women's March, pro-life groups were denied access to march, and they consider themselves feminists, but they just had a few different ideas of the term. So what do you think about that? Does that cause a divide within the feminist or the women's movement?
I think it does, honestly. I think we need to have a common definition of what it means. And if you're going to have a movement be inclusive as possible, you have to have a wide range of opinions. I mean, to think that all women think one way is fundamentally incorrect.
Yes.
And I think what initially split the women's movement in the 1970s were conflicts over specific policies that were being put forward, as well as Roe versus Wade. But there was this split in the women's movement, but there's still the women's movement, and there's still these differing perspectives within it. And I think that, again, we do a disservice to women to kind of try to boil it down to one thing.
How do women solve this divide, though? How do they create kind of an understanding by saying, I'm a feminist, and if you have a negative connotation of that word, or vice versa, how do they solve these issues? How do
I think
they
it's a
get
matter
past
of
this?
dialogue. You're not going to arrive at that in 6 months or a year. I think it's part of the long-term dialogue. And feminism, like the term liberal, has been so demonized in my generation that I think we have to have maybe more of a discussion about what that means and take some of the stigma away. I mean, if you're actually trying to promote women's rights, I don't see how that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think you have to, I think it starts with dialogue, but I think it goes back to education and about, talking what feminism is, and about talking what, these big philosophical ideas are, and then what they create, what the movement has done, what it's done for women, and then where the differences are in the movement. I think you need to have an open conversation about not everybody agrees about these issues. And if you talk about that, then it's okay. But right now, it's not okay to talk about it.
No. Well, you guys are giving some great insight. We're going to be right back, and we're going to be talking about how the press has been covering the women's movement since the 21st. So stay with us, and we'll be right back. With the Women's March happening in all 50 states and in countries around the world, the march received a lot of media attention. Social media was flooded with videos, pictures, and the press covering the event. Now the world is wondering, what now, after this historic display? So I want to ask you guys, what is coming next? We have seen this historic turnout, and like you said, it was bigger than even what you expected. Mm-hmm. And so now everyone is watching. So what do you think is to come?
I think that the primary thing that's going to come out of this is that there's more of an awareness that there is a level of concern about these issues in general. While there might be disagreements about where these issues go forward, that overall there is concern about them and that people are paying attention. Whereas to some extent, these issues actually were not covered all that much in the campaign process leading up to the election and, of course, then the inauguration. There was coverage of some of the negative things that Trump had said about women, but there really wasn't a whole lot of talk about women's issues writ large. And I think now that they're going to have to start thinking about how they're going to talk about those, knowing that you've got a broader audience paying attention.
On that point, do you think that because these weren't talked about and because of past statements that Donald Trump had made, that kind of even put a bigger divide in women speaking out against him for these statements and versus women who weren't?
I mean, certainly there was a partisan component to that. And, when you look at the things that Donald Trump said during the campaign process about women, some of his derogatory comments made from, in the past that came to light, I think that you do have that does spill over into what people were marching about. You see that on some of the signs. Certainly you saw it in the hats. Yes. But it is broader than that. And I think that there is a general concern amongst women and women who are marching about some of these issues. And certainly recognizing the partisan divide, but I think there is some concern about how we go forward talking about these issues in the public realm and in the public sphere.
Yes.
I think we're probably also oversimplifying this because to say that the press has one voice, I'm pretty sure that Fox News covered it differently than CNN,
yes.
Just for an example. But I think it is a statement to the Trump administration that as part of the democratic process, I mean, he himself said something about free speech, which I found was quite interesting. But I think it's kind of not a warning. A warning wouldn't be what I'd be, but a statement that not everybody's on his side, and a lot of people are offended by some of the things that have been said or some of the early positions taken by the administration.
Great. We have a clip from Karen Olson, who was part of the organizing process for the Women's March. So we're going to see her message to women to come out to the march. Here it is.
We're mobilizing on January 21st, but it doesn't stop there. After we've drawn attention to our goals, the challenge that we face in order to make sure that our rights are protected and the rights of those around us, we can move forward from being mobilized to creating campaigns. So I'd like to ask you to think about what happens on January 22nd. What will we do with all of this amazing experience organizing our march? How will we pay it forward? What will we do next? I want to ask you not only to stay tuned, but to stay involved.
She mentions campaigns and staying involved, and so it's being compared right now to many of the movements that we've seen, like Black Lives Matter, social media movements. So do you think that this is what this is going to turn into, or are we going to continue seeing protests?
I think you'll continue to see some protests, but they may be more particular in nature. Again, what I'd like to see come out of this is see more women get involved and run as candidates.
Yes.
I mean, that I think would be the big takeaway from this. If you really want to be involved in this, really get involved, put yourself out there, and we're always talking about we don't have enough women in the Oklahoma legislature or on and on and on. We need more good female candidates, period.
Yes.
I think too, you're starting to see some effect. I mean, the DeVos nomination for education secretary garnered a huge backlash, and the ringleaders for the backlash amongst most people were women who were concerned about education and education policy and how that was going to go forward. What her reaction to schools. The two women Republican senators who broke with their party, they're women, and they, thought she wasn't qualified, and they said that on record. And so I think you are seeing some things come out of that movement. It might just not be specific to women. It might be in education, it might be in healthcare, it might be in other areas, and they might not just do it as a single effort, but rather taking it forward in their own different areas.
What about Hillary Clinton? She was forefront in the election, and do you think that her position that she has held has created kind of a negative to women campaigning and women stepping up? We saw many women coming in, the Republicans definitely winning, but do you think her position that she's held kind of puts like a stigma on the way women can potentially run? And now with DeVos and this backlash, do you think that shows any negatives to women campaigning?
I don't necessarily think so. I think there is a certain level at which women have to understand there's going to have to be a standard of equalness in terms of male and female candidates, and there's some other things that go along with that. But if she would have said one thing that I wish she would have said more of is women's rights are human rights.
I think women candidates are often unfairly treated. We talk about what they wear, we talk about their makeup, we talk about their hair in a way that we don't always talk about for male candidates, and we see that. And I think that women candidates overwhelmingly receive more negative attention than male candidates. And certainly, I think that Hillary Clinton's level of, the people, how many people know about her, how many people disliked Hillary Clinton. The question is how much of that is gendered and how much of that is policy. And I get the feeling that it's gendered, that it's uncomfortable to have such a strong woman and as a leader. And I think that that's a real negative. I think that's something that will be more detrimental to us going forward than anything.
Yeah, I was hoping we'd be a little further down this road than maybe we are.
But there were many people coming out after the election. There was, upset for the Democrat Party, but there were lots of people who were pushing for women to continue. Many late show hosts, different people like that, Seth Meyers, came out and did a full monologue about how he hoped women would get more involved. Do we see any women who are in the Senate, legislature, anything, who are looking forward to running or have that?
I think it's too early to tell that. I think you look at 2018 or 2020, and particularly I think that's important for the Democrats because there's a leadership void now, a generational void.
Yes.
When Elizabeth Warren is perhaps your youngest person, and speaking of some of the things, I can't think of a single person who is more unequally portrayed in the press, especially when they're taking a picture, and she's always,
Yeah.
which is not a flattering look.
No. I would think, I mean, I think it is too early. I would agree with that. We're probably about a year out from the kind of serious conversations about who might run, who might not run, who started that process. I have heard certain names floated within the Democratic Party. Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a senator from New York, shook over Hillary Clinton's seat, and there a few others. So there's some names out there. I think that women, in general, it really does start with your local government, with getting on your city councils and getting on your school boards and getting into the state legislature. And I think that when you start to see policy change at those places, that's really where then we start to see more women elected to Congress and then hopefully into the presidency.
I mean, I think what you're really looking at is almost a generational wave.
Yeah,
I completely
is.
agree with
Yeah.
you, but you don't go from 0 to 60 in 10 seconds. It takes, you have to find your way out and find that politics that you can be effective, that you can find your voice, and that you can unite others. And that doesn't just happen in 1 second.
No, it doesn't.
What about women on the conservative side, the Republican Party? We saw many women take office, but do you think that potentially a women Republican president could be in the future?
I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Right now, certainly the names at the top of the Republican, ticket, you have a sitting president. If he chooses to run again in 4 years, then of course that's who you're going to have. But you have a lot of the names at the top. You have Ted Cruz, you have Marco Rubio, you have Mike Pence. And so most of the names do seem to be male. Most of the leadership does seem to be male, but there are a lot of strong female Republican members of the House, members of the Senate, and governors. We've seen a number of female governors that are Republicans that I think do have the capacity to be able to put forward their name.
I think one of to be specific, I think Nikki Haley is
Yes.
one
Yes.
who,
Yeah.
in the new administration, really, President Trump has actually put her in a position to shine, and she has, I think, a good record as governor of South Carolina.
Yes.
She appeals to a lot of people, but I think she has that kind of middle ground as a Republican that both moderates and conservatives can relate to.
Yeah.
Do you think that will be a turning point for how, bipartisanship and how things are divided right now? Do you think that women stepping up in the conservative movement will bring these ties together at all?
Possibly. I mean, in the U.S. Senate, for instance, you actually have a group, and it's very informal, but it's kind of led by one of the senators from California, where all the female senators meet every so often at her house, and they talk about things, and they're not allowed to use negative language. It's always discussed in the positive. And I think if you're looking for those kind of things, they're out there, but we need more of them.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that it's not going to, again, change overnight. I think there is an effect, over the long term. I'm not sure that by simply having more women running, that we're necessarily going to change the dynamic of the to create a more bipartisan environment. There are other things certainly that have to change along with that. Rhetoric, for example, the way we talk to one another about issues, certainly those things have to change as well.
Great. We are going to take a break right now. Whenever we come back, we're going to be talking about Sean Spicer and the way he responded to the Women's March, and also the way that overall the Trump administration responded to the march. Stay tuned.
OCU is that open shot to a winning goal.
Countless rehearsals for one flawless routine.
Learning to serve before trying to lead.
Learning a language everyone can understand. OCU is
Me.
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 I'm OCU.
day after the Women's March, Press Secretary Sean Spicer held a press conference discussing the protest. We have a video now of what he said. Let's take a look.
You know, this is what makes our country so beautiful, is that on one day you can inaugurate a president, on the next day people can occupy the same space to protest something. But he's also cognizant to the fact that a lot of these people were there to protest an issue of concern to them and not against anything. That there were people that came to the mall, as they do all the time, sometimes in smaller numbers.
So this was not the entire clip, of course, but what did you guys think of that response, that immediate response that they came out with?
Well, I think it was kind of what you would expect from him. I mean, the administration has not always been on an even keel with its message, and Spicer and the president himself has sometimes been a little on the offensive, or maybe the language is a little harsher than what we're used to. And so I don't read anything particular into that, honestly.
Okay.
I thought the press response from from the press secretary, Sean Spicer, was certainly pretty even keeled. I would agree with that. But certainly some of the other things that were coming out from the administration were not. There were some criticisms. There was, the statement that the crowd at the Women's March was actually smaller than what was reported. They were saying, so there were some derogatory comments coming out. So I'm not sure that, necessarily they're all speaking on the same plane. That they sent this press secretary out to say some things, but then they were kind of talking about other things in a different way.
Yes.
Well, the administration seems to be struggling for who has the last word and who has the last word before Donald Trump has something to say.
Yes. Yes. Do you think that they have, not to say more important things to focus on, especially the day after being inaugurated, they had the Supreme Court that they needed to address. They needed to address several different things, cabinet positions. Do you think that this wasn't necessarily on their forefront, and so they didn't pay attention very much, and so it kind of caused some criticism and different things?
Oh, I think they were paying attention. I think that they, but they didn't want it to garner the attention that it was garnering, was the way I took it. That the best way to try to kind of, not make it have as big of an impact was to kind of downplay its importance. And by downplaying its importance, then you don't have to talk about it as much. When in reality, I think it had a pretty profound impact, both a visual impact, but also an impact on the idea that maybe there weren't not as many people who were happy about the inauguration as they thought.
I wouldn't disagree with any of the statements that Kate made. I just think that the administration is really looking for its voice. We knew that we were electing somebody very different. We knew that some of the dialogue was going to be different. And so I think we're dealing with kind of a new normal here. And if we don't recognize that, then we're living in an alternate reality.
Yes.
Yes. And talking about how this is a little different than what we expected, Donald Trump's tweets continuously have, through the campaigns, through the election, this has been definitely something that's been discussed, but now the media has tried to back off of focusing on his tweets as much, not looking at the legitimacy of them. But the day after the march, he tweeted and said, "Watched protests yesterday, but was under the impression that we just had an election. Why didn't those people vote? Celebs hurt cause badly." And then 2 hours later, he came back and said, "Peaceful protests are a hallmark of our democracy. Even if I don't always agree, I recognize the rights of people that express their views." What do you think about that? 2 hours later, he has a completely different response.
Well, I mean, it just shows that, again, the inconsistency with getting the message there. I certainly didn't disagree with the second statement, which I thought was very balanced and fair in its content. But I think you're looking for an administration that is trying to find its dialogue, its message, and it has a rough relationship with the media. And I just think it's going to take time to get the political dialogue right.
I think Trump has the tendency to tweet immediately with his initial thoughts, and then I don't know what it is, if there's somebody who comes to him or if there's a process or he has second thoughts about it, and then he comes back with something later. Either he edits a tweet, or he deletes a tweet, or he issues another one that's a little bit more kind of politically acceptable. Tries to tame the message, and I think that there's some concern in that. Certainly his initial tweet, I think, indicates what his thought process was, which is that he saw the march and he was kind of unimpressed by it. And then his comment about why don't these people vote? Well, we don't know if they voted or not. They could have voted. And in fact, most of the people I know who did go to the march did vote and are politically active. So I think that it's this question, he likes to breathe kind of illegitimacy into different things, whether it's the press, whether it's, the Women's March, whether it's institutions of government, whether it's the judicial system. He likes to try to breathe kind of illegitimacy into these things, and that's dangerous.
Do you think that might have brought other Trump supporters, especially people who read his tweets, do you think that they are still buying into the things that he says?
From what I've seen, yes. I was particularly referring to CNN had a series of discussions with Trump supporters in Arizona, and they said some things that I would not have used, including the word transparent. But very clearly there is a very strong attachment from Trump supporters for Trump. That's part of the reason he won. The people who are with him really seem to be very with him, and I think there'll be plenty of protests, and I think we're going to see kind of at least at various points, perhaps a rocky relationship.
There have been a number of polls that have come out just in the last week that have talked about, how we've had the first, presidential numbers on, how people think he's doing, and his poll numbers are down. But amongst Republicans, there was a 96% approval rating amongst Republicans, but what they're finding is that they wish that he would approach differently. They like what he's doing in terms of policy, but not necessarily the approach, particularly the tweeting. So there is some kind of concern about maybe he's doing the things we want him to do, but maybe not in the way we want him to do them.
There's some positive, definitely, to that.
Yeah.
So last question I have for you guys today. How do you think that this administration, like you said, they're trying to find their message, they're trying to figure these things out with his tweets and all. How do you think that they're going to go forward with women's health issues, the things that were discussed at the march, the LGBT rights, different things like that were definitely driven by the march?
I find that the whole discussion of lesbian and gay rights to be very interesting because Donald Trump has a long history of supporting, and you see this sort of break between perhaps Vice President Pence and his own daughter and son-in-law. And so it creates this idea that whoever talks to him last has made up his mind or has influenced him. And so it'll be very interesting to see where that goes. And maybe what we see is the administration pulls back on some of the more controversial things and leaves it a little bit more to Ryan and to the leadership in the Senate, who maybe are a little more articulate or traditional in their way of expressing messages.
I think with respect to the women's health issues, Planned Parenthood, defunding of Planned Parenthood, access to women's health, and a whole variety of other issues, especially also the things that are involved in the Affordable Care Act that affect women's health, from access to birth control to a number of other things. I think that's primarily going to be the purview of Congress. I don't think that he's going to get down into the nitty-gritty details of dealing with those specific issues. First of all, it's a hornet's nest. And second of all, Congress, I think, is really kind of chomping at the bit to be able to take on those issues more directly. With respect to the LGBTQ issues, there was a report last week about Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump it really being kind of the voice in Donald Trump's ear with respect to those issues, and their longtime family support of LGBTQ equality as being something that certainly is somewhat counter to the more conservative thought, but that maybe you're not going to see as much action on that, at least out of the Trump administration.
Great. I have loved all of these responses. Thank you both so much for being here. That's all the time that we have today, but stay tuned with us and we're going to have a great show for you next time. So thank you again to Dr. Johnson and Professor Huston. You guys have been wonderful. We'll see you next time. Thank you guys. Very much.